We'd like to thank everyone to our second to last seminar. And for today, we have a very exciting seminar as always. This one was unanticipated. We had a little switch around in the schedule. So we are happy that today we have Professor David Hoekema, the coordinator of the Calvin College Semester Abroad program. And also we have, once again, our very own illustrious and praiseworthy chair, Prof, full Professor Albert K. Awedoba, who specializes in various aspects of conflict, corruption in Ghana, and many more. And I will leave it to him to introduce our speaker for today. So if everyone can give them a big round of applause. So with no further ado, I'll turn it.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed for enabling me to act as a chairperson for this important lecture. Well, as has been our custom, we start off by introducing the speaker. And today's speaker really is not someone you would want me to introduce because he doesn't need any introduction at all. He has been with us for quite some time. He came here, he was here at the very beginning of the semester with some of his students. And we see him, he's someone that we see every day. So he's a visiting professor in this institute. I've known him since 2004 when he first visited with his students to this country. His face is one that we see every day. In a sense, I'm surprised that we have not given him a day name. Maybe we should give him one of these day names, Kofi, Peku, or whatever. So maybe think about that. So all the same, it is important, since it is our customer, I'm going to try to introduce him. And to be able to do this, I have a CV. The only problem is that the CV is so long, I'm not sure I'll be able to get this CV presented to you in the time that we need to do this. But what I like to tell you that, at least to meet the formalities, what I like to tell you is that David Hoekema is a professor of philosophy at the Calvin College, Grand Rapids, Michigan, the US. In his professional life, he has occupied numerous significant positions in this college. He has been chair of the philosophy department of Calvin College. He's been dean of natural sciences and mathematics and contextual disciplines at Calvin College. Also interim vice president for student life at Calvin, and director of graduate studies, and finally director study Ghana semester program. So these are just a few significant positions that Professor David Hoekema has occupied over the years. He's been visiting professor in several places in the US, in Europe, in Africa, and so on. As director of the study Ghana semester program, he's been visiting this place. It started somewhere around 2004, was here in 2005, 2010, and now 2014. I believe he's also visited with the students, he's also visited Uganda with the students, where he conducted some research, and that is part of today's discussion, some of the things that he discovered when he researched in Uganda. His main areas of interest are political philosophy, which includes the philosophies of violence and non-violence, the philosophy of art, academic ethics, and the moral climate of universities, African philosophies, traditional and contemporary. It's got a large number of publications. As far as his books are concerned, I was able to count 5, which have already been published. There are also 2 in the process of being published. As far as his other publications, summary publications, articles, papers, and so on and so forth are concerned, I counted up to 100 and lost count. So that tells you the kind of person we are going to be listening to. Now let us take the topic that he's going to be talking to us about. It says, the title is Picking Up Pieces and Making Peace. The churches and the LRA conflict in northern Uganda. So this is a presentation which is going to center on peacemaking. And I like to think that it is also going to tell us something about an interesting personality, somebody called Joseph Coyne. Now this guy is the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army of northern Uganda. It seems to me, it strikes me as a prophet, a messiah, a seeker of the millennium, a rapist, a murderer, a madman, and currently a wanted fugitive sought after by the International Court of Justice, The Hague. Perhaps to understand fully this issue about peacemaking, many questions need to be asked about people like that. Who exactly is this man called Joseph Coyne, a former mass server? Can we say that he's a modern day Nilotic war prophet, like the Okellos of former times? Is he a modern day Ubara Yakam cult prophet, exuding charisma, religion, like the biblical Moses? Is he the successor of Madam Alice Lukwenya, also called Auma, continue where Alice stopped? It appears that to be able to understand fully the religion, politics, and economics of this man, and of his actual followers as an actual person, or even where the actual ethnic group itself is located in the context of Uganda, modern Uganda, we need to ask quite a number of questions about what is going on, about this person's history, and so on and so forth. And I like to think that in doing this kind of interrogation, we are going to be in a position to understand many more issues about conflict and conflict resolution. There have been people who have come on, like the Koynes, people like the Amin Dadas, the Mobutus, the Kabilas, the Charles Taylors, and so on and so forth. Or even if you go to North Nigeria right now, the Boko Haram, you go to Somalia. All of these need to be looked at. And I think we can gain a kind of insight into what is going on and the solutions to some of these problems by considering a case that is before us today. It appears that conventional approaches have not always told us the truth, the full story. And perhaps we need to look at the other side. We need to think outside the box. And I'm persuaded that today's presentation by Prof. Hoekema is going to educate us on how to look at the other side. And if we do, what we're going to see, and how that is going to enhance our understanding of peacemaking, and so on and so forth in Africa, and so on. So without much ado, I think I've already taken so much time. I understand the talk is going to be a little lengthy, so I don't want to continue beyond this point. I'd like to stop here and invite Professor Hoekema to share his ideas and his researches with us. So Professor Hoekema, the ball is now in your court. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. But you'll Medine to call me. I am honored to be able to address this weekly seminar. I've enjoyed very much the presentations I've been attending all semester when I wasn't traveling. And I'm very pleased to see many familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces in the audience. And I know that some are also watching through Skype. I wonder whether some of my colleagues who I work with in Uganda may be tuned in on Skype. And I know that none of my American colleagues have any conflicting meetings just now because it's 4 a.m. So they may be up preparing their Thanksgiving meal. My students actually are preparing a Thanksgiving meal at my flat even while I speak. I will go straight into my paper. I know that my students do not complain that I talk too slow. They do often complain that I talk too fast, and I know the accent is a problem also, so I will try to speak slowly enough to be understood, which will mean I will need to summarize. It's a rather long paper, and the invitation to present it here came just on Monday morning, so I've had to quickly adapt the paper I had given earlier. But I hope I can convey something of what I learned in Uganda to my friends and colleagues at what has become, I must say, my second academic home, the Institute in the University of Ghana, because I spent 4 semesters here now and benefited greatly from the formal and informal exchanges with colleagues and students. This is my topic. This is an interim report on a research project supported by the Nagel Institute at Calvin College, the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity. I want to credit for their support. And it reports on research that I conducted in Bulu, Uganda in January of this year in collaboration with Sister Lucy Dora Okello, who is a lecturer in education at Uganda Martyrs University in central Uganda. And this is Sister Lucy and me on the common mode of transportation as we're coming back from whatever interviews in Uganda. Just a couple of maps to locate for those of you who don't know African geography very well. This is an interesting satellite image that gives a sense of the aridity of northern Africa, the density of foliage in Central Africa. Uganda, of course, is here just on the shores of Lake Victoria. This, I don't have Uganda outlined here. It does, you can see the area where Uganda is on the border between Nilo-Saharan and Bantu languages, which I'll make reference to. The ethnic groups are divided between those 2 major groups. And this, of course, shows that Uganda was part of British East Africa, a stretch, an area from Egypt to Sudan to Uganda to Kenya in the colonial period. This is a locating map of Uganda. You can see Kampala, the capital, on the shore, almost on the shore of Lake Victoria, and then Bulu, where I conduct my research, is in the north. We traveled to Arua, to refugee camps with the students. Between Bulu and Lira is the Acholi Landa region, which was the center of the LRA conflict. And this is a linguistic and ethnic map. I don't know if the names are large enough to read, but you see the Longo and Acholi regions in the central brown part, and that is the region where I was conducting my research. What the world knows about the Lord's Resistance Army mainly comes from one video. Asked to name 3 major developments in the past quarter century in Africa, most Western observers could probably name 3. Multiracial democracy in South Africa, genocide in Rwanda, and Joseph Kony's rebellion in Uganda. But the problem is that much of what the world knows about the LRA conflict is false. This video was posted by the nonprofit organization Invisible Children in March 2012, 1 month after I had returned from a month's study of community development and post-conflict restoration in northern Uganda. What the world saw in that video differed dramatically from what my students and I had heard and seen from residents of the Acholi subregion. Ugandans who viewed the video, I learned later, expressed anger and disbelief at some of its misrepresentations. In the past few years, I've sought out sources and interviewed individuals who provide a more complete and accurate picture than that offered by news media and activist organizations. What I've learned has changed my understanding of the sources and consequences of conflict, the role of religion as both cause and cure for war, and the importance of African examples for addressing war and conflict. Indispensable to my learning have been the generosity and honesty of Ugandan friends and colleagues. From their observations and experiences, it is evident that conventional ways of assessing the morality of violence and countering its effects are often futile, if not harmful, but that coordinated and courageous action can succeed where conventional means of resolution have failed. Especially critical, they showed me, was the readiness of religious leaders to overcome the mistrust between their communities, form collaborative partnerships, and take significant risks for the sake of peace and reconciliation. In this presentation, which is part of a book in progress, I will try to convey some insights that my interview subjects have shared with me and some lessons to be learned from their experience, especially with reference to when resistance against a powerful but illegitimate authority is justified. the best place to begin is by recounting some of the experiences that they endured. The story of patience, which is actually not her real name. This is the one interview subject who asked me not to use her actual name. At 12 years of age, fearing that like other girls of her age, she might be swept up in a raid by the soldiers of the Lord's Resistance Army, Patience took refuge in her older sister's compound. Her sister lived nearby, in the Gulu sub-region, but there were no school-age children in her household, and Patience believed she would be safe there. She was mistaken. Soldiers swept through the village, found Patience's hiding place, and took her captive with other children in the village. The soldiers looted village compounds for food and other supplies, but did not capture older children or adults, explaining later that they were already infected with immorality and could not be part of the LRA movement. They smeared our bodies with oil, she told me, and they said that this would make us quiet and cooperative. Later they used shea butter, an emulsifier. You all know what shea butter is, and we need to explain for an American audience. LRA soldiers applied shea butter to their own arms, legs, and bodies and spread it on their captives too, in initiation rites that ARPLI as part of the group. The soldiers also told patients that if government troops should fire on them, the butter would protect their bodies against bullets. Patients spent 7 years in the bush, moving from camp to camp. Our main job was to carry looted goods, she said. If we became tired and stopped to rest, the soldiers would beat us. Sometimes they told us to go to a village and ask for money. If you did not succeed, they might kill you. Each time government troops began to move in on an LRA camp, the soldiers would move into nearby villages to terrorize the residents and abduct more children, warning them that there would be more to come if anyone in the village cooperated with the government. At the age of 13, Patience was assigned as a wife to a much older LRA officer who was one of the bodyguards of the founder and leader of the movement, Joseph Kony. Her husband, using that term very loosely, already had 3 other wives, and some of the children were older than Patience. As the youngest wife, she drew resentment from the other wives, who mistreated her, and she was often beaten by her husband if she did anything to displease him. Nevertheless, she bore him 2 children, a boy and a girl. I interviewed her in January 2014, 14 years after she escaped from captivity. She spent a few months in a rehabilitation center where she received medical treatment for bullet wounds. The shea butter did not help. One of her children escaped with her, and she was reunited with the other 3 years later after he made his own escape. Employed as a maid in the hospital, Patience met a man who is now her husband. They have 2 children, 6 and 4. Her older children from the bush, now aged 15 and 13, are part of the family also. Her husband has accepted them fully as his own children, she said, but they still have many painful memories. The prayers of those who ask God to help us escape were very powerful, Patience told me. Please keep praying for those who have not yet been released. My Ugandan colleague, Margaret Angusia, also at Uganda Margaret University, has collected many other stories of formerly abducted children. I refer to her book in the credits at the end. Paul's story. Paul Rubangakene. You see, I keep a bulletproof vest here in my office, said Paul, director of the Justice and Peace Commission of the Gulu Archdiocese of the Catholic Church. But it has been many years since I felt any need to wear it while traveling. In the late 1990s, the situation was very different. At that time, the government had control of towns and trading centers, he said, but the LRA did whatever it wanted in the countryside and isolated villages. On a trip to Patiko, a village north of Gulu, Paul encountered an LRA ambush along the main road. He managed to abandon his vehicle and flee into the bush, where he remained in hiding for 2 weeks, and then proceeded along a safer route east to Kitgum and eventually back to Gulu. There is a monument along the Patiko Road to 59 residents who were massacred in another instance at a spot where he escaped. There were 2 periods of especially widespread LRA violence, he told me, from 96 to 98, when LRA troops were in frequent battle with government forces, and then once again from 2001 to 2003, after the LRA returned to Uganda from Sudan and intensified its campaigns of looting and abduction. For 2 years, Paul and his family were night commuters who slept on the grounds of the Catholic Cathedral in the town of Gulu to avoid nightly raids on a residential compound nearby. Catholic relief services provided bedding, food, and other aid to all who needed it, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Muslim, during this period. In 2003, Joseph Kony's father passed away in Gulu. Unwilling to risk appearing in public himself, Kony sent one of his subordinates to verify that he had received a proper burial and funeral. While in town, the LRA commander and his accompanying soldiers burned 3 cars and kidnapped several children. Rebel soldiers came to the door of Paul's family home. They looked in and saw my children, but thanks be to God, they did not abduct them, said Paul. After the withdrawal of LRA in 2006, Paul worked with former LRA soldiers in rehabilitation camps, where he heard stories that defied belief. One former commander recognized an abducted boy on the basis of Paul's description and told him, "Yes, I knew him. He was a very clever boy, so I beat him to death." The boy was Paul's nephew. His parents know that he was killed in the LRA camps, but Paul has not told them where he learned about the circumstances of his death. What the world knows about the LRA conflict. How can such unspeakable horrors have occurred, not in the distant past, but in our own century? How could a force such as the LRA ever have come to control large regions of a nation that has an elected president and parliament, a relatively free press, a sizable national army, and a history of cooperation with Great Britain and its neighbors on matters of regional security? These questions are answered for most observers around the world by a narrative in which colonialism, religion, and tribalism all play a leading role. Let me summarize the conventional wisdom. First, this conflict, like other conflicts across Africa, is rooted in the depredations of European colonial rule, a legacy of the late 19th century. The British colonies of East Africa, like all other European outposts across the continent, achieved independence in the early 1960s and took their place in the world stage as independent nations. But the class divisions, economic dependencies, alien religions, and racial disparities that colonialism created remain very much in evidence. And new nation after new nation, nominally democratic institutions became the tools by which already established elites maintained their power, suppressing opposition just as effectively and sometimes more brutally than their colonial predecessors. The people of northern Uganda had been left behind in Great Britain's development strategies, maintained as a region of abject poverty and hence as a source of cheap labor for the South. Uganda's first national governments did nothing to remedy its neglect. In striking out the Ugandan national government, the LRA was effectively still trying to combat the lingering effects of British colonial rule. The brutality of its tactics mirrored the brutality of colonial practices. Uganda, according to the story, is just one of many nations where the deep wounds to society created by the slave trade and by European colonial exploitation is still a root cause of today's violent conflict. That's one thesis of the conventional view. The second relates to the religious legacy of European domination. Missionaries brought a new religion to Africa, an alien system of belief that spread slowly through the region in the middle and late 19th century, much more rapidly in the 20th. Although the missionaries undoubtedly benefited the native populations in some ways, such as creating schools and hospitals, they also cut them off from traditional ways of life and severed essential ties to family and community that had characterized African society for millennia. Urged on by missionaries, Africans rejected the teachings and practices of their elders, spurned the rituals that had brought community together at pagan festivals, and discovered that they were, after all, autonomous individuals entitled to make their own choices and live their own lives. The goal of the missionaries was to wipe out pagan superstition and replace it with European-flavored Christianity. But in the pursuit of this goal, they unwittingly created fertile soil for the most bizarre and destructive sorts of hybridized religion. All across the continent, self-proclaimed religious leaders emerged who were possessed by powerful spirits, quoted from the Bible and from traditional proverbs, and put a Christian gloss on traditional rituals, such as animal sacrifice and divination. Many of them proclaimed themselves divine, or their followers did. Joseph Kony, it is said, was just such a quasi-religious leader, drawing and then manipulating others in ways that would not have been possible without his special status as a sort of spiritual entrepreneur. He insisted on strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, observed both Friday and Sunday as holy days, and frequently conversed with the spirits. Many Christians and Muslims as well regarded him as delusional, not inspired, but others saw in Kony a distinctly African gospel, reclaiming religious authority from the Europeans who had tried to impose European values and practice on them. Colonialism then was one cause of conflict, religion another, and the third element of the conventional view is that Kony could never have succeeded without a deep well of tribal identity and intertribal animosity that pervades African society. This is a holdover not from European domination, but from Africa's own long history. In its most benign form, it's been well expressed in the concept of Ubuntu, a term for shared humanity in the Nguni language of Southern Africa that's often translated loosely, I am because we are. Identity for Africans is always social and communal, not individual, as claimed. The most malignant forms of tribalism are all too evident. Examples can be cited that go back several centuries. Asante subjugation of surrounding peoples in West Africa, Zulu military conquest in Southern Africa, Hausa Igbo conflict in the Biafran War, and most notorious of all, the Hutu-Tutsi conflict in Rwanda and elsewhere. In all these cases, according to this theory, the tenuous loyalty that citizens feel toward their nation, which is a relatively new creation built on the foundations of colonialism, has yielded to far deeper loyalties to tribe. Rather than join hands to build a multi-ethnic society, on this view, Africans are far too ready to take arms against their neighbors for the sake of tribal honor. The conflict in northern Uganda was one more example of tribalism trumping national unity on this view. So this is what the world knows, so to speak, about the LRA conflict. It's rooted in colonial exploitation, succeeded because of the disruptive influence of Western religion, and employed means that are alien to contemporary Western sensibilities because it tapped deeply into African tribalism. None of these claims is wholly without merit, but neither is any of them more than, say, 1/4 true. Colonialism, first of all, was a context but not a cause for this conflict. And I'll skip over this quickly because of lack of time, but the British domination of East Africa certainly continues to influence Uganda and the rest of East Africa. The transport infrastructure, the school system were established, English is the language of instruction. The United Kingdom was Uganda's leading trading partner, though that may now have been overtaken by China. The legal system is British. The Church of Uganda is an Anglican church. It's the dominant Church of Uganda, accounts for about half the country's population. But these relationships of history, culture, and trade played no significant role in the rise of internal conflict. The notion that the heavy weight of European colonial impression continues to dominate Ugandan political and social life is, in my judgment, a fantasy. Indeed, when we review the colonial and pre-colonial history, we find surprising examples of colonizers' positive influence. One example that I threw up here is Sir Samuel Baker. For many centuries before the arrival of the British, East Africans had suffered significant losses to the slave trade that was organized and coordinated by Arab traders in the interior who bought or captured Africans and sent them overland and along the coast to buyers in the Middle East. Sir Samuel Baker expelled the slave traders as Governor General of British holdings in Sudan and northern Uganda in the late 1970s and helped bring an end to the practice of slavery. If there's any basis for linking the rise of LRA to colonial practices and policies, it lies in the favoritism towards certain ethnic groups and neglect of others. Here's the 1/4 truth in this thesis. Competition among ethnic groups following independence was a continuation of rivalries that were exploited, if not created, by British authorities. Let's take up the third thesis about tribalism, and I'll turn last to religion. Tribal conflict and political violence. The nation of Uganda was named for its most populous ethnic group, the Buganda, whose population is concentrated in the southern region of the country, north of Lake Victoria. The British gave favored status to the Buganda and their king, the Kabaka, whose palace was located in the capital, Kampala. They granted a limited degree of autonomy to 3 other ethnic groups of southern Uganda, all part of the Bantu family of languages, the Toro, Ankole, and Bunyoro. The people of northern Uganda, the brown area north of Victoria, people of northern Uganda were Nilotic in origin, related to ethnic groups living in Sudan, western Ethiopia, and northern Kenya. I won't go through the details of the languages and peoples here. There's also a small pocket in the very far northwestern corner of Kakwa and Lubara people on the Congolese border. This is a complicated picture with ethnic and linguistic borderlines that often span national boundaries. Its importance as background is primarily in the way British favoritism shaped post-independence politics. The nation's first prime minister, Milton Obote, later as president on 2 different occasions, was a member of the Lango group, neighbors to the Acholi, who resented Buganda's domination. But Obote came to power with the assistance of a Buganda loyalist party and appointed the Kabaka as ceremonial head of state. When Obote was ousted in 1971 by a trusted subordinate, Army Commander Idi Amin, ethnic resentment was a major factor once again. Amin was a member of the small Central Sudanese majority, ethnically Kakwa. To consolidate his power, he rooted out other ethnic groups in the military, particularly the Lango and Acholi. These became the core of a military force that trained in Tanzania and helped overthrow the Amin regime in 1979. Although the Nilotic people were victors in war, they became victims of widespread violence in the peace that followed. Years of political and social chaos ended when Yoweri Museveni, a member of the Ankole group from the far southwestern corner of Uganda, transformed his guerrilla force into a successful political party and came to power in 1986. Through numerous elections, constitutional revisions to remove term limits, and other vicissitudes of politics, he remains Uganda's president today. And the northern regions of the country were once again relegated to comparative neglect, fueling resentment. So the conventional view of African tribalism driving perpetual conflict does not fit Uganda, even though ethnic tensions are never entirely absent. From what sources did the LRA movement draw its power? Well, let's turn to the third part of the conventional wisdom. Was religion the cause? And just a few minutes, Professor Aldova already referred to Alice Lakwena. A little bit about that. Lakwena formed an armed force, the Holy Spirit Movement, shortly after Museveni came to power in 1986. She took the name of a deceased, she was born Alice Alika Alma, took the name of a deceased army officer whose name means messenger. She said that the dead officer spoke through her, conveying messages from God, that people would defeat the national government if only they would employ prayer and ritual anointing and rely with confidence on supernatural aid. She attracted recruits from this disbanded rebel army, and from many disaffected Acholi and Langa residents. She actually led a military campaign against the national forces, which was decisively defeated. Her movement was destroyed. She fled to Kenya, where she lived the remaining 20 years in obscurity in a refugee settlement. But one Acholi man, believed to be a relative of Lakwena, was paying close attention, and his name was Joseph Kony. When Kony began to recruit members of a new movement, which initially was called the Lord's Resistance Movement, then the Lord's Resistance Army, he too emphasized strict obedience to God's laws and rigorous self-discipline. Some describe him as possessed at different times by as many as 13 different spirits of deities and ancestors, all of whom advised him on how to instruct his followers in the ways of obedience to God. We turn to another story. Moses Okello Rubangageyo was abducted at age 16 from Sir Samuel Baker Secondary School with 39 other students. They were taken across the border to Sudan. Only 25 survived that journey. 2 brothers died soon afterward. Moses is today the only survivor of that group of 39. But in our interview, he described the horrors of being beaten, forced to assist in other abductions, and even forced to kill captives. After he survived these ordeals, he was given higher and higher levels of responsibility. Among those under his command were some of the soldiers who had abducted him. Moses bears the wounds of 4 bullets that struck him, one so deeply lodged in his chest that it cannot be removed. Joseph Kony spoke often about messages he received from spirits, he said, and they were a basis for strict enforcement of many rules. Smoking and drinking were strictly prohibited in LRA camps, as was having sexual relations with anyone who had not been formally given to you as your assigned spouse. I think it's a necessary requirement for all Institute of Ethnic Studies seminars that they make some reference to sex. Isn't that right? One officer of the LRA, he told me, was caught having sex with a young woman without authorization. He was beaten in public 600 times and then stabbed to death with a bayonet. Everyone in the camps was required to attend weekly prayer meetings, often led by Kony, who would stand the whole day long in prayer. Many camp rules are based on Old Testament laws. Skipping forward, offenses against religious and moral code were punished severely. Both Friday and Sunday were holy days, honoring both Muslim and Christian practices. Anyone who went out to work in a garden on Friday or Sunday would be punished by having his hands cut off, he said. And you would be beaten if you rode a bicycle. Residents of the Acholi region who lived in constant fear of LRAs did not regard Kony as having any legitimate spiritual authority, yet many feared that his successes were aided by malignant spiritual forces. The leaders of Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim communities worked tirelessly to provide places of refuge and to counter the religious claims of the LRA. And as we will see below, when they came together, they were able to achieve what 2 decades of military pressure could not achieve: negotiations that led to the end of LRA occupation and cessation of its civil war. The Lord's Resistance Army waged a 2-decade-long war on the people of Uganda, of northern Uganda, and the government of Uganda. A long tradition of moral and theological reflection on justice in going to war and its conduct offers guidance on how religious leaders should ask their governments to respond. Religious leaders in the Christian tradition, in the first instance, both because the tradition informally labeled the just war doctrine as the most clearly articulated in the tradition, and because the overwhelming majority of Ugandans, including northern Ugandans, are Christian. Without question, this was an unjust war. By the standards of Christian and Islamic teachings on war, it was a brutal and unauthorized conflict. Kony initially claimed that neglect of the region and misconduct of soldiers were legitimate causes for defensive war, but war as it developed had no clear goals, and the tactics were unspeakably brutal. Was the government military campaign then an example of justified war? In the abstract, it would appear so. But the counter-violence was equally brutal. Rape, abduction, murder were common when government forces came into a village. So the response was no better in many ways. The cure was no better than the disease. The 2012 video gives the impression that in 2012, raids and abductions were still being conducted in northern Uganda and nothing was being done to stop them. An aspect of the video that especially angered Ugandans who have viewed it. In fact, northern Uganda has been, on the whole, a safe and peaceful region, though an economically very backward one, since the LRA withdrew in 2006. The United States government has taken its lesson from the events of past decades and is seeking to defeat Joseph Kony in his hideout, probably in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Invisible Children supports that effort, works very closely with the U.S. Army. I actually met a Special Forces soldier who told me about his interview of refugees. Is this the right response, a military response? Nearly all the Ugandans with whom I spoke disagree strongly. In the first place, to label the counter-campaigns of the national resistance movement an instance of just war is absurd.
On a deeper level, Ugandans I spoke to said meeting an unjust military campaign with another military campaign cannot lead to a just or peaceful outcome because in 20 years, the military force achieved almost nothing. In advocating a military defeat of Joseph Kony and his two remaining loyalists, the governments of Uganda and the United States and advocacy groups like Invisible Children are misreading the Ugandan situation and continuing a course of action that promises few, if any, benefits for those who suffered most. Perhaps we need to step back and reconsider the situation from a different perspective. And that's what the religious leaders of the region did, and why they succeeded in ending the conflict where 20 years of diplomatic and military pressure had failed. The stories of Alice Lakwina and Joseph Kony lend some support to the conventional view of African conflicts said earlier. Both are charismatic leaders who combine elements of traditional religion with elements of Christianity. So there's an element of truth in the view that religion fueled this conflict. But the most remarkable story that emerged from my interviews with religious leaders, arranged by Sister Lucy Okello, who's a native of Gulu, in January, concerned a development that has few precedents in East Africa or anywhere else. Leaders of the three major religious groups in northern Uganda, Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim, began meeting together in the late 90s in order to form a strategy that would bring an end to decades of violence. They did so in ways that were scarcely visible even in their own communities, let alone the residents of the rest of Uganda or the rest of the world. And by patient and courageous cooperative action, they achieved a seemingly impossible result. In the late 90s and early 2000s, they met repeatedly with senior commanders of the LRA to convey the depth of suffering the conflict was inflicting on the region. Travel between towns in northern Uganda was extremely dangerous, but the religious leaders undertook several trips to remote sites on both sides of the Sudanese border to engage LRA leaders in discussions about how to end the conflict. No less courageous was their willingness to confront the high command of the National Resistance Army. The army must withdraw, and they insisted the peace is to be achieved. The initiative was described to me by one of its agents, principal agents, the Reverend Patrick Lumumba, Diocesan Planning and Development Officer for the Anglican Diocese of Northern Uganda. Initially, he said, no one trusted the group's representatives. The rebels regarded us as collaborators and would not talk to us. The government regarded us as LRA sympathizers and would not talk to us. But ARPLI responded by holding a series of 7 public prayer meetings, bringing all the religious groups of the region together. Before long, the 3 major groups were joined by others as well: the Orthodox, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Pentecostals, the independent evangelical churches, and the Ugandan usage, the born-agains. Conversation with Sheikh Musa Khalil, the Qadi of the Muslim Acholi district, I saw in his picture a few slides ago, but we don't here. That's Sheikh Khalil. He told me, we began meeting in 1998, first in the Chief's Palace, then in a hotel, then in the Catholic Cathedral. In a military barracks, a meeting was arranged with President Museveni, who gave his blessing for their efforts to mediate the conflict. Our role was to build a bridge between fighting forces, he said, and the means we used was to sensitize the community with the weapon of forgiveness, using the Bible and the Quran. Each year from 1998 until the conflict ended, they sponsored a peace march in Gulu. The Juba peace talks held in 1996 were formally convened by an international coalition of the United Nations, with ARPLI participating as an observer. But what's clear from the reports of those involved is that this would never have taken place were it not for 2 decades, or nearly a decade then, of patient efforts in which Christian and Muslim leaders joined together against seemingly impossible obstacles to bring an end to war and a beginning to peace. And I'll skip over the details here. The agreement was never signed because Kony refused to come, probably because he was indicted in The Hague. Many believe that the indictment actually was what persuaded him not to show up. But the agreement nevertheless was honored, and LRA withdrew from Uganda and released its abductees in 2006. But Sheikh Musa said, we knew in 1998 the trauma would last far longer than the war. Issues of land tenure, gender violence, and HIV/AIDS would be no less difficult than the problems of civil war. Reverend Lumumba added that by 2006 it had become clear that the work of interfaith cooperation had strong support from government leaders, limited recognition from leaders in local communities, and hardly any credibility from rank-and-file members of churches and mosques. For that reason, they have now undertaken to organize local religious peace committees in every local congregation, every local community. And programs on land reform, domestic violence, and agricultural development are under local oversight. What have we learned? For the first decade of LRA domination, religious communities and leaders don't seem to have anticipated any significant role in resolving the conflict. They provided pastoral advice and practical help. No one to whom I spoke believed that Joseph Kony's claims of spiritual authority played a major role in his rise to power. What did work in his favor was his resolute defense of the rights of northern people. But whatever credibility he had was quickly evaporated as his tactics became more and more brutal. Religious leaders continued to offer what assistance they could to victims of LRA attack. They looked more deeply into what had created and now sustained such rampant and destructive violence, and what they saw led them to take action in a way that few could have anticipated. If they viewed the conflict through the lens of Christian and Muslim teachings about violence, they saw a relentless and unscrupulous warlord victimizing a defenseless population, requiring the intervention of a legitimate armed force to bring about his defeat. But if they viewed it instead through the lens of their suffering congregants in their communities, the picture was very different. They saw communities living in constant fear, young people subjected to unimaginable mistreatment, a sporadic armed conflict in which each side, an armed conflict in which each side committed unspeakable atrocities. A region that had become isolated because roads were unsafe, a farming economy deprived of the opportunity to plant and harvest crops, a population rendered virtually invisible to the world, or visible only as yet one more instance of Africans' propensity for ethnic fighting. And under all of these, they saw a fundamental lack of trust, a rupture in the close ties to family and community that are so central to most African traditions. Change would come only with bold and courageous action. That action began with the creation of a new coalition of Christian and Muslim leaders in Gulu, working under the leadership initially of the Catholic Archbishop. The Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative resolved to explore ways in which their position in the community might open the doors to de-escalation and resolution of the conflict. From the formation of the ARPLI in 1997, Monsignor Matthew Okello told me, we identified three major areas of work: advocacy with the Ugandan government and international organizations, dialogue with all parties involved, and reconciliation in the communities in northern Uganda. As killings and abductions continued, he said, the newly formed group were dismayed by the unwillingness of international organizations to intervene or even take note of what was occurring. Where was the United Nations? Where was the African Union, he asked. If one European was abducted anywhere in Africa, it became global news. If 100 Ugandan boys and girls were abducted to be tortured and kept captive and used as child soldiers or so-called wives, no one paid any attention. Leaders of the ARPLI saw many effects more subtle but no less damaging. Many social problems, said Monsignor Okello, were becoming evident. Suicide, a sense of hopelessness, a social disintegration of the entire Acholi culture. The traditional evening time for gathering around the fire in the center of the village, the classroom in which Acholi culture has been learned for many generations, had vanished under the threat of LRA raids. Military action, they knew, could not address these problems. What was needed was a fundamentally new approach, one that sought to displace violence with dialogue. In order to achieve that end, they came to the conclusion that they might be able to set this approach in motion. They enjoyed the respect of communities, even within the LRA camps, they hoped. Their resolve to launch this initiative would enhance the respect due to Uganda by all parties. So they undertook a series of meetings with representatives of the Ugandan government. They also, I didn't mention this, I skipped over this, they assisted with the night commuting, the places of refuge in the towns. They began negotiations with the two sides. Monsignor Adong said, there is an Acholi proverb, when two elephants are fighting, it is the grass that suffers. We were the voice of the grass. We knew that military options could never solve our problems. Do you know why Kony and his associates were willing to talk to you, I asked. I think he knew that we were simply seeking peace and would not take sides. We were holding both Joseph Kony and President Museveni to their responsibility to care for the people for whom they were responsible. When the religious leaders met with the president, said Odom, they felt that Museveni greatly underestimated the scale of the damage that was being done, and the rest of the world was paying no attention. So he felt a little pressure to resolve the conflict. But he was willing to direct the military commanders to moderate their tactics and allow ARPLI talks with the LRA to continue. It was we who proposed amnesty following a ceasefire, said Monsignor Odom. A law to that effect was enacted in the year 2000. Following the passage of that, Riek Machar, then governor of the southern region of Sudan, later president of South Sudan, began working with Ugandan international representatives to draw up specific provisions for a ceasefire, under which the LRA would release all those who had abducted, while the Ugandan government would halt military action. That was drawn up and promulgated in 2006, was to be approved finally in 2008. It was not finally approved, but it has been honored. The reassimilation of young people after decades of captivity posed daunting challenges. Nearly as challenging was the rebuilding of rural life. as families return to villages where their homes have been burned, their lands left untilled or appropriated by others. Their children had come of age in the camps, far from their family plots, and all their life had seen food coming from trucks, not from the farm. Recovery from the effects of this war will take 50 years, said the Monsignor, but religious leaders continue to work together. Continue to work together to address the most urgent needs of their communities, from healing the wounds of trauma to agricultural training and rebuilding their communities. And I'll skip over that section to the closing section. So, if we attend closely to the actions of religious leaders, yes. Whoops, I'm going too fast. We'll give you a sneak preview here. If we attend closely, we see the outlines of a little-known and largely untested way of responding to violence when it disrupts communities and destroys lives. Ethical analysis of rights and wrongs and tradition of just war motivated government counter-violence. Similar reasons motivate current U.S. government support for regional military efforts. But even if successful, a military campaign to capture or kill Joseph Kony will do little to restore the lives of the people in communities. The leaders of the Catholic, Protestant, and Muslim communities, by contrast, saw the necessity of coming together to address the roots of the conflict and create conditions for dialogue. Simply talking to each other was an important and difficult first step in a country and region where not only Christian-Muslim, but also Catholic-Protestant tension and mistrust have historically prevailed. But they succeeded in creating a close partnership, engaging support from their respective communities, and bringing all sides to the table in ways that made possible something that could never have been achieved by any sort of military initiative. An end of the conflict that had the support and cooperation of all sides. They did not set aside or disregard their fundamental differences of theology or morality. Rather, they recognized the welfare of each of their communities depended critically on finding a resolution to the conflict, and they resolved together to take enormous risks toward that end. That's my own phone, warning that I'm really in the contemporary world, war seldom arrives with parliamentary declarations and massive invasions. More often it grows slowly, a cancer within society, in ways that are initially difficult to discern, arising out of internal grievances and exacerbated tensions. Soon, mistrust bears fruit in violence, divisions become more polarized and harden into armed confrontations, and communities affected suffer in ways that no one anticipated. In circumstances such as these, which are also common not just across Africa, but around the world, the example of religious leaders of northern Uganda offers a remarkable record of little-noted success and a model for patient, courageous, and principled efforts to address the roots, ameliorate the effects, and prevent the recurrence of war. What lessons can be learned from their example? Let me suggest 5 that stand out in the judgment of someone who has a particular interest in the way in which political control and moral authority relate to each other. First, political control enforced by brutality can be challenged by coordinated resistance. LRA control was virtually uncontested in the Acholi and Langa subregions for nearly 2 decades. Intermittent military campaigns by the National Resistance Army only increased the suffering of the population without yielding any relief from brutality. But when the people of the region, encouraged by their religious leaders, began... All right, thanks. But when the people of the region, encouraged by religious leaders, began to demonstrate active measures of cooperation and protection, they were empowered to resist in other ways also. Second, cooperation among religious leaders can be a catalyst for rebuilding trust in communities. For the past century in Uganda, hostility between religious groups has been high. Christian groups have fought bitterly with each other over regional dominance in the British period. Even Protestant-Catholic cooperation has been difficult to achieve. Relations between Christian and Muslim communities in Uganda, as elsewhere in East Africa, by contrast with Ghana, have been marked by tension and mistrust. The success of the ARPLI in bringing these divisions In bridging these divisions was an important example to their members that they could achieve far more through cooperation than in isolation. Third, the risks of seeking peace are no less grave than the dangers of waging war. It's difficult now to imagine the anxiety of ARPLI leaders who first initiated talks with both the National Resistance Movement and LRA officers, both of them guilty of unspeakable atrocities, both known to be relentless in punishing anyone perceived as having deceived or betrayed them. They persisted. Fourth, courageous leadership brings a moral authority that can undermine illegitimate political control. The question how the people of northern Uganda came to have the courage to stand up and how the LRA realized it could no longer dominate has much to do with the courageous leadership that these religious leaders showed. And last, ending armed conflict is only a step toward peace. What I heard over and over again from my interview subjects in Uganda was the LRA conflict is done, the peace is not nearly here yet because of so much disruption, but we are working together toward that end. Thank you for your attention. I conclude by saying religious leaders of the Acholi subregion have put their moral teachings into action. Every good tree bears good fruit, said Jesus, and Ugandans love their fruit. Here are a couple of my photographs showing fruit in Uganda. I give my thanks to the Nagel Institute for supporting my research, to the Institute of African Studies for permitting me this platform. World Renew Uganda is the organization that facilitated my travel with my students. Sister Lucy Dora Okello, I've mentioned, my collaborator, the ARPLI staff and board, and also my Calvin College students who were with me in Uganda in January 2014. I mentioned, here's my contact information, a couple of recent publications, one that I just obtained last night. It's from a forthcoming issue of Christian Century. It's an article not about the LRA conflict, but about the Ugandans' generosity toward refugees. Ugandans support 7 times as many refugees per capita than does the United States. And this is an article where I comment on the upswelling of resentment against refugees in the United States and Ugandans who simply say, these people have no home, we have to take care of them. An article that deals with some questions about missions and modernity. It's a review of an article by Nigerian American, some of you know his work, Olufemi Taiwo, and an article about African politics and moral vision, and then some sources that I use that you might want to make a note of if you want to know more about Uganda. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thanks very much, Professor Hoekema, for this very informative and insightful presentation on what is happening in northern Uganda, or what has happened, has continues to happen in northern Uganda. I believe that Professor Hoekema would want to listen to us because our inputs will certainly enable him to revise and enhance his paper. As I pointed out, this is a paper, this is after writing a book on the subject. So we very much appreciate our comments, questions, and suggestions. Yeah. So let me begin by asking for clarification. It appears that this kind of rebellion or conflict, or however you like to call it, has tended to more or less draw its lifeline, its support for certain communities. We've been told about the Acholi, the Langu especially. This is the hub, the area, the arena within which this kind of resistance draws support and life. And I'd like to find out what is so special about the Langu and the Acholi, for which reason a rebellion of this nature will find its anchor in these areas and not in any other part of Uganda. Or maybe in the past, other parts of Uganda have also more or less supported these kinds of uprisings. But I'd like to request that you throw more light on the issue there. My second question is whether it is possible for you to give us a kind of profile of northern Uganda in terms of religious denominations and so on and so forth. This for me is necessary because you have told us about coalitions between religions and so on and so forth, especially between the Christians and the Muslims. I was just wondering whether in this community, in this part of Uganda, you do have people who adhere to traditional religious belief systems. Or is it that the dominant religions are just the Christians and the Muslims? And of course, if that were the case, we can understand why there wouldn't be any need to involve local traditional practitioners and so on and so forth in the coalitions. Thank you. So may we take a few more questions before Professor Hoekema can respond?
Yeah, good morning. Your presentation was very interesting. Now, in contemporary anthropology, terms like fetish and pagan are unacceptable because they are considered derogatory by some modern scholars. Now, during your presentation, you referred to pagan superstition and pagan festival. Can you define what you mean by pagan in the context in which it was used? When you say pagan, what are you saying? Are you saying that people didn't have any concept of God or monotheism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoekema, for very stimulating discussions. Two questions. One is, would you like to share with us some specific experiences that you encountered, whilst conducting this research? Because I know that in conducting research in conflict-prone areas, it can be very dangerous. What were some of the specific challenges that you faced, and how did you overcome it? Secondly, I tend to agree with you with respect to the lessons I learned from the study. However, I'm wondering the extent to which we can build lasting peace without addressing the economic dimensions of the conflict. In other words, I know that issues of inequality, poverty, are very central to this conflict. And to what extent can we build sustainable peace without addressing the economic dimensions of this conflict? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hoekema, Professor, for your bringing us news from another part of Africa, because we are often quite centered around Ghana. I would like to first of all endorse what the first person said about certain terminology and add tribe to it, because I fail to understand how huge nations like the Hausa and so on can be called tribes in this day and age. So I think that, I just want to know, especially because in the United States a lot of work is being done to try and get us to find the right kind of terminology. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that I felt like you left us hanging a little bit, because I was looking for the secret of how they actually did it and what mechanisms they used. And I felt like you were hiding that. So could you tell us what the secret was?
Yes, thank you. Excellent questions all. Let me, in a way, Professor Odoba's question, the second, and Professor Sutherland's are variations on the same question about terminology. My intent was always to use terms like pagan, tribe, in, so to speak, in quotation marks. I believe the only use of pagan was when I was referring to the mentality of 19th century missionaries who regarded their task as driving out paganism. And I intended to use tribe and tribalism only within quotation marks of the conventional view of ethnic conflict. Yes, I appreciate the correction. I probably wasn't as consistent as I intended to be. Certainly, my own view is that paganism, animism, and tribalism are terms that may once have had a clear and non-derogatory meaning, but they have a derogatory meaning that should be avoided. So I entirely agree. I will try to be careful to avoid using those terms. Ethnic divisions, different nations. We've seen in North America that we don't talk about Indian tribes, we talk about Indian nations, or in the Canadian context, First Peoples. Yes, terms are important to show respect for these different phenomena. As for the prevalence of traditional religion, I don't know enough to give a very good answer to that question. Certainly there are traditional healers, certainly in Uganda, as in every part of Africa where I have experience, and I've had the privilege of living for a semester in Kenya, a semester in South Africa, and short visits to Uganda, as well as short visits to other countries. It seems to me that the reliance upon traditional beliefs, traditional rituals surrounding outdooring, birth outdooring, marriage, death, persist. To varying degrees, these have been synthesized with Christian and Muslim patterns. In every country I know of, there are battles between Christian leaders who say you're adopting too much of the non-Christian practices, and Christian leaders who say no, these non-Christian practices reflect a respect for the supreme God, and so forth. I don't believe, so far as I know,
I did not learn of any communities in which traditional religious practices are the dominant religious practice. My impression is that they are an overlay, an element of religious practices, but that nearly all the population of northern Uganda and Uganda as a whole classifies itself as either Christian or Muslim, Protestant, Catholic, or Muslim. I might mention, Protestant Catholic tensions were intense in the 19th century. There were literally battles, there were fights, there were not armed battles, but literally fights between Catholic and Protestant missionaries for control. One of the things that brought them together was an example of the conflict between traditional and modern values, which was the massacre of 26 young men by the Kabaka because they refused to be sexual partners for the Kabaka in the 1880s. 26 young men, boys really, were killed for disobedience to the Kabaka. And the Ugandans, of course, now look at that with revulsion, but it brought Protestants and Catholics together. The Uganda martyrs, after whom the Catholic University is named, are revered by Catholic and Protestant together, and in a rather tragic way, the suffering of Catholic and Protestant young men in the court of the Kabaka was one of the critical events that both made Ugandans say we have to be very discriminating in our affirmation of traditional authority, and made them say we have to overcome Protestant and Catholic differences. But in general, my observation of Christian-Muslim relations in East Africa is that it is not very healthy. There's a lot of mistrust and misunderstanding between those communities. I meet Christians who have the most wild misapprehensions about Islam sometimes in East Africa. Why the Lango and Acholi peoples? I don't know how to answer that question. It clearly has a lot to do with their having felt as if for the entire period of British rule they were neglected. They're having felt that when Idi Amin came to power, he pushed them. They had been critical to the armed forces. Idi Amin's armed forces essentially excluded them. So there are these long-term resentments. Apart from that, I just don't know what to say, except that it is a predominantly agricultural, relatively low population area, and in those circumstances, it was easy for a sense of isolation to grow, and for Kony initially to tap into a sense that he could win respect and win the rights of the Lango and Acholi in a way that the national government would not grant without his movement. But apart from that, I really don't know what more to say. Dr. Sanji's question about personal challenges. Well, in terms of personal danger, I think the most serious danger I faced was riding on the back of that motorcycle taxi. It is a peaceful region now. There was a time, even after 2006, I have been told that as late as 2009, 2010, it was unsafe to travel between cities, that people traveled in armed convoys, that there were frequent attacks. There were many, many, many guns at large in northern Uganda. But that, thank God, has dissipated. Travel is now quite safe. Travel at night is risky, but it's risky in many, many places in the world. So in terms of personal safety, there were really no challenges. I think the biggest personal challenge for me was simply hearing these stories and listening to someone who said, yes, I spent 14 years as the conscripted wife of an LRA commander. Yes, I spent 10 years commanding these forces under Joseph Kony. Yes, I found myself having to oversee the soldiers who had abducted me, and I tried to treat them with compassion and forgiveness. I was just astonished by the personal courage, the deep wells of forgiveness, and the resilience of the people I spoke to. I think that was the most difficult challenge for me. But in terms of personal danger and the like, it really was done. And I must say, Sister Lucy, who knows the region very well, was invaluable in helping me win cooperation and trust from the many interview subjects that I talked to. Dr. Sanji's last other question, can peace be achieved without economic empowerment? No, of course not. And yes, there's a danger of looking superficially and saying the armed conflict is over, everything is okay now. And I think the ARPLI leaders, I left out some of the interview excerpts that I had in the written part of the paper. The ARPLI leaders realize that, and they understand that the work of restoring agricultural productivity, training young men who have never planted or harvested, and young women, how to grow their crops, resolving the many, many land disputes, because I didn't make reference to this, again, I skipped that part of the paper, but from about 1996 2007 until 2006, virtually the entire population of northern Uganda was either in the few cities that were still safe or in refugee camps. And there were people who grew up in refugee camps and never lived in their home village. They came back to the village, found that someone else had occupied their house, was on their land. Land issues, economic productivity issues, issues of gender, issues of disease, HIV/AIDS are very, very important. And I think religious leaders understand that they have a very long way to go. And that peace is not peace until it is achieved in a context in which there is a measure of equality and a measure of welfare for everyone. And that's certainly very true.
I think what caught my attention was the rehabilitation of abductees. I just wanted to know who abducted who and for what reason. And then a second one is I just wanted to know if the reason for the abduction was quite different from other parts of Africa.
I'm sorry, you can clarify. The first question was?
Yeah, the first question was who abducted who and for what reason?
Who abducted who?
Yes.
Okay.
And then the second one, if the reason for abduction were different from other reasons of abduction in other African
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prof, for the presentation. I have two questions I want to ask. The first one is, has the activities of LRA assumed an international dimension? I mean, is it very important for you to have boots on the ground from the international community, as we have special forces from the so-called policeman of the world, that is the United States, on ground to apprehend the LRA? Then the second question I want to ask is the country a failed state as far as security is concerned? Is it important for the international community to try to strengthen the security apparatus of Uganda, or give attention to what has been called additional variables instead of so-called attention to the security apparatus in tackling the issue of LRA? Because it is assumed that apart from this security issue I'm talking of, there are other intervening variables that are also very imperative if you really want to tackle this issue. So I just want to ask if boot for boot, as we have it, is the antidote to what we are having in Uganda. Thank you.
Observations. First one, I think I heard you say missionaries brought religion to Africa. You probably want to rephrase that. I think they brought European version of religion to Africa. There was religion before they arrived. My other observation is about your interviews. I wonder whether you were able to verify the information they present to you. Because you know, it's the advantages of interviewing people, memory loss, and so on and so forth. Could you verify the facts they gave to you to make sure that this is really the true story? My last observation is a suggestion. I was excited about your analysis of causation, from colonialism to religion. I'm wondering if you can organize your material into two categories. One, the underlying causes for this crisis, and two, the immediate causes. That will be more meaningful than to speculate whether it was colonial heritage or religion or transatlantic trade. Thank you.
I also had a question which is actually related to Prof. Gordon's last point. At the outset of the presentation, there were several things that were presented as what the world knows. That you said, these are perhaps no more than 1/4% truth. And, part of my question is, okay, with your methodology of interviews, I really didn't see the link from the first-hand accounts that the people were giving and the ideas of causation of, was it caused by, did these European religions destabilize things, the preferential treatment given from one ethnic group to another, pre-existing ethnic divisions that were used along the lines of divide and conquer. I really didn't see how the methodology could prove that this particular thing is only 1/4 true, this particular thing, because you're getting on the ground experiences, but those to me didn't really prove your point that it's not 100% true. I don't think that it's any of those things are necessarily 100% true, but you know, I wanted a better link between causation and then what you did in order to prove your hypothesis that these things are what the world knows, but those aren't actually what it is on the ground.
And perhaps to add to some of the questions, I'd like to find out from Professor Hoekema whether he was able to interview people who were sympathizers of the Lord's Resistance Army. It looks like most of the people spoken to tended to criticize them. Is it possible that there are also constituencies which supported this army? Thank you.
He just wanted to find out how your research relates to other situations in Africa, e.g. Sierra Leone and Liberia. I really wanted him to answer right now, but that was his question.
Okay, all good questions. I feel as if, my goodness, I know so little about these very important questions, and can just give a little hint at where I think the answers might lie. To start with the last one, the civil wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone certainly bear strong resemblance to the LRA movement in northern Uganda, in that they involved a charismatic leader, involved abduction of child soldiers, involved rampant cruelty involving cutting off of limbs, murder, burning of villages. I don't know enough to say whether the causes were similar, though what I have read about the West African conflicts indicates that the lingering resentment of one ethnic group against others played a very important role in each case. That charismatic and unscrupulous leaders were able to exploit ethnic resentment in ways that facilitated their rise to power. But beyond that, I don't know. It seems to me that the civil wars in Sierra Leone, Liberia, were much less satisfactorily settled. Certainly, the situation on the ground in Liberia and Sierra Leone is, if northern Uganda is suffering, Sierra Leone and Liberia are suffering far worse, even apart from the Ebola epidemic. That the infrastructure is very poor. I've never visited those countries. I've had friends and colleagues who've worked in them over many years. So I can't say much more than yes, there do seem to be some parallel phenomena, but I don't know enough to say just what they were. Then the question, who abducted whom, and was it similar as in other conflicts? Well, the abductions were, I mentioned that there seemed to be a kind of optimum age. The LRA would abduct children between about age 6 and 10 or 12, not older children, not young children, and they were trained as child soldiers. They were used as impressed wives, concubines to military leaders. In some cases, some of the women who were abducted simply lived in compounds and cooked and were part of an extended family for the duration of the conflict. I think from what I've read, all the boys were trained as soldiers, but not all took part in combat. Some simply were trained and stayed in military camps. But it was abduction of Acholi by Acholi. It was the same ethnic group abducting their own ethnic fellow members of the ethnic group. It was not one ethnic group targeting another, as it often has been in such conflicts. Was it the same as in other cases? Again, I don't know enough to say that. Certainly, conflicts in the DRC, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia follow the same pattern. If you've seen the film Blood Diamonds with Leonardo DiCaprio, I think it's an absolutely terrible film in many, many respects, but there is a 10-minute excerpt there that is the best depiction I've ever seen of how the indoctrination of boys works in movements that have child soldiers. I recommend that 10 minutes. I don't recommend the rest, which is basically an action flick set in the Civil War. But so I don't know if it's the same. And the abductions,
the abductions clearly were meant to terrorize. The abductions were meant to frighten communities and not cooperating with the government. They were also, of course, meant to replenish the armed forces of the LRA. Question about the international context. Special forces, is Uganda a failed state? How do we bolster security? I don't myself agree with the mentality that says we need international armed forces to defeat a force like Joseph Kony. It seems to me the example of the Ugandan army is a very, very poor one. Even if it had been a well-disciplined force that committed no atrocities, I have no confidence that it would have ended the conflict sooner. Nor do I believe that the U.S. Special Forces are doing an indispensable role today. I am not prepared to say they're doing harm. It seems to me they are working with local forces. But international force in this case seems, I don't see reasons to think it would have been effective. There are good reasons to think that an international force could have been very effective had it been deployed in Rwanda in 1994, before the Okello genocide. That might well have made some difference. I don't see evidence that would have made a difference here. But Uganda cannot be called a failed state, certainly not. It has an effective national government. It has an autocratic leader who has stayed in power for 2.5 decades. It has an opposition that is often oppressed, but the Museveni government doesn't kill its opponents, it just jails them and harasses them. It's not a failed state. Its armed forces are very poorly disciplined, poorly trained, but on the whole, Uganda is economically, its economy shows some signs of growth. Its infrastructure is better than many in Africa. By contrast with the neighboring states like the DRC, Uganda is in reasonably good order. DRC, Eastern Congo, is virtually a stateless area where the central government has no control. So I would not say Uganda is a failed state. It is a state that has many political and other problems. Professor Gordon, if I said missionaries brought religion, I misspoke. I hope that I said missionaries brought the Christian religion, but if I said missionaries brought religion, it was a slip on my part, because of course they met God in Africa. They didn't bring God to Africa. I have been thoroughly indoctrinated by my esteemed colleagues at the Ecoffic Episcopal Institute to understand how Christianity is convergent with, not opposed to, traditional African reverence for the one who made us and who is the source of all life. Did I verify the interview subject report? I did not, and that's a very good question. And here, a historian is speaking to a philosopher. A philosopher looks for ideas, a historian looks for verifiable facts. No, I verified them only in the sense that what I heard is congruent with what has been published by those who have done exhaustive studies of history. It's a very important question, and a good reminder to me that I mustn't take these first-hand accounts as necessarily entirely veritable. They're reporting on memories of events that may, in some cases, be inaccurate memories. And the question of underlying causes versus long-term causes, yes, indeed. A very important question, and I need to. One of those areas where I appreciate your comments is indicating where I work to try to sort out those which different factors play a role. Did I interview LRA sympathizers? No, I did not. I doubt that anyone in Uganda who now believes that the LRA was a movement with the right intentions gone wrong would be willing to speak up and say that today. In the way that a few Germans who supported Nazism are willing to speak out, and unfortunately some are. It would be very, very dangerous to speak any words of support. I did hear, and actually I had these in my paper, but I omitted it. I did hear from some of the informants. For example, the first woman I spoke to, she says a number of times that the worst atrocities were committed by soldiers who disobeyed Kony's orders, that they were sometimes told not to kill anyone, and they went ahead and killed people in villages. She told stories about commanders being severely punished, sometimes executed, because they were more cruel than Kony had authorized. I left that out because it's such a complicated picture. I certainly would not want to say, oh, Kony was okay, he just got a bad press. That's absurd. But yes, some of those who escaped, in their stories of their time under captivity, would say, we regret and deplore the atrocities, and yet
much of our life was a good life, and in some ways a better life than we had in the community who left. So certainly those who spent years in captivity, depending on where they were, and in fact, my colleague Margaret Angusia, in her book, reports on 2 women she interviewed, both of whom were conscripted wives for commanders, one of whom described a life of unspeakable cruelty and constant beatings and deprivations and hunger and being forced to do much more work than she could sustain, a life that she was suffering under every day. Another described a life in which she was treated very well. She had a nice place to live. Her children stayed with her. She had house help. She felt as if she was treated. Of course, she was abducted. She was not there by her own will, but she felt she was treated very, very, very kindly during her captivity. So there are these stories. I did not hear those stories myself personally, but those stories are there. I suppose.
Let's make the last question or comment.
We had the other one about the link between the methodology and the causation, the underlying cause.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, let's have the last question and answer that too.
Yeah, time is quite on our side.
Thank you, Prof. My question is simple. Would amnesty be critical in finding lasting peace in Uganda? And if it's critical, will it be accepted by all groups, or certain particular groups would accept it and others would reject it? Thank you.
Yes, that's a good question. I mentioned that only in passing. Amnesty was essential, and it's clear that the LRA would not have withdrawn had there not been a law passed that granted amnesty to those who had participated in the movement. And there were exceptions. The commanders would not have been granted immunity, and the commanders mostly left with Kony to go into hiding in Sudan and CAR and DRC. But all of those, I don't remember exactly how it was defined, but those who were lower level commanders and soldiers and others were granted amnesty. And without that, I think, without that, the LRA would not have been willing to withdraw. Amnesty is always a very controversial measure. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, being the most widely known example. It is clearly a sacrifice of justice for peace, and it is sometimes a necessary sacrifice, but morally it's difficult to swallow. Amnesty, if it had not been offered, would clearly have blocked a resolution. I'm sorry, I overlooked Odelli's question about the connections. Yes, what you're telling me, Odelli, is that I've got some pieces and huge missing pieces to connect them. I need to try to tie in what I learned from interviews, how that completes the picture, and I need to say much more about why I think these stories about colonialism, about religion, about ethnicity are only partly true and where the truth in them lies. And that does need to be developed much more. I was giving you sort of my opinion without my underlying arguments and then moved into the individual interviews. But you're quite right to say there was a great leap there, which I leapt over without calling attention to it. So thanks for the reminder that needs to be filled in. Thank you all very much for your attention. This has been very stimulating for me and helping me think through the next steps in this project. And I'm very grateful that there was an unanticipated opening in the schedule.
Thanks very much indeed. I think we've all enjoyed this presentation. It's been very educative. We've had the opportunity to learn about another part of Africa. And I believe there are still questions and comments that people want to make or ask. What my advice is that let us continue the discussion after this meeting. It is important for us to break down because there are other activities that have been scheduled to take place. So on that note, I'd like to thank Professor Hoekema on your behalf for this exciting presentation and to wish you very well in his endeavors. So eventually when the book comes out, I hope copies will simply African Studies can all read the book and understand some of the issues that engage people's attention as well as our attention on the other side of Africa. Thanks very much indeed.
And this is the article I mentioned that just came out. And I have a couple of copies and I can make more if you'd like to see it. This is specifically on refugees in Uganda, not LRA.
All right.
We would like to thank Professor Hoekema once more for stepping in on very, very short notice. If everyone can give him a round of applause. Also, of course, for stepping into chair. Give yourselves a big round of applause for coming out in your numbers as you always do. And an announcement that next week we have our very final seminar presentation, and it will be done by Dr. Obadele Kamban, a very, very well-noted scholar, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy it. So again, we thank you for coming out, and we'll see you next week in the same place at the same time.